The Doomsday Mom, when love, faith, and madness ended in murder. Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we're going deep into one of the most disturbing and complex true crime cases in recent American history. This is a story that has everything you'd expect from a fictional thriller, except it's devastatingly, horrifyingly real. It's a story about a beauty pageant contestant turned mother who came to believe she was a goddess destined to lead people through the end times. It's about a self-proclaimed prophet who wrote books about the apocalypse and claimed he could communicate with the dead. It's about two missing children whose faces appeared on billboards across America, whose grandparents pleaded on national television for their safe return, only for their worst fears to be confirmed when law enforcement discovered two small bodies buried in a rural Idaho backyard. This is the story of Vallow Daybell and Chad Daybell, a couple whose twisted religious beliefs and obsessive romance would leave a trail of bodies across multiple states. 3 confirmed murders, 2 attempted murders, multiple suspicious deaths that may never be fully explained. And at the center of it all, 2 innocent children, 7-year-old Joshua Jackson, JJ Vallow, an autistic boy who loved his red pajamas and playing with his toys, and 16-year-old Tylee Ryan, a teenager who loved Chipotle and driving her Jeep, a girl who was just beginning to figure out who she was and who she wanted to be. The case of the Doomsday Mom, as the media would come to call Vallow Daybell, isn't just about murder. It's about how seemingly ordinary people can become radicalized by fringe beliefs. It's about how love can become obsession, how faith can become fanaticism, and how the human capacity for self-deception can lead to unspeakable evil. It's about a mother who referred to her own children as zombies, whose bodies had been possessed by dark spirits, who smiled for the camera on a Hawaiian beach just weeks after burying them in shallow graves. As we trace this story from its beginning, through the disappearance of JJ and Tylee to the horrific discoveries that would follow, we'll explore not just what happened, but how it happened. How did a woman who friends described as a devoted mother transform into someone capable of murdering her own children? How did a seemingly harmless author of religious fiction become an accomplice to multiple homicides? And perhaps most importantly, how did they manage to operate for so long, leaving a wake of death behind them before anyone could stop them? This is a story that demands to be told, not for the sensational aspects, though there are certainly shocking elements, but because understanding what happened might help us recognize the warning signs when someone we love begins to slip away from reality. It's a story about the people who tried to save JJ and Tylee, about the investigators who refused to give up, and about a family torn apart by secrets, lies, and an ideology that valued the eternal over the lives of the living. So settle in. This is going to be a long journey, and parts of it will be difficult to hear. But it's a journey worth taking, because at the end of it, we honor the memories of JJ Vallow and Tylee Ryan, 2 children who deserved so much better than the fate that awaited them. Part 1. Before the Darkness, the early lives of Lori and Chad. To understand how this story ends, we need to understand where it begins. And it begins, as so many American stories do, with 2 people who seemed, on the surface at least, relatively ordinary. Lori Noreen Cox was born on June 26, 1973, in Loma Linda, California, into a family that adhered to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, commonly known as the Mormon Church. But her family wasn't just religiously conservative. They were also deeply suspicious of government authority, Her parents were tax protesters who followed sovereign citizen ideology, spending about 2 decades in conflict with the Internal Revenue Service. This anti-government sentiment, this belief that ordinary rules didn't necessarily apply to them, would be one of the threads running through Lori's entire life. Growing up, Lori was by all accounts attractive, charismatic, and ambitious. She had dreams of fame and success, dreams that seemed attainable when you looked at her. In 2004, she competed in the Mrs. Texas beauty pageant, standing on stage in evening gowns and swimsuits, smiling for judges who would assess her poise and personality. That same year, she appeared as a contestant on Wheel of Fortune, spinning the wheel and guessing letters, hoping to win cash and prizes. These weren't the actions of someone plotting murder. These were the actions of someone who wanted recognition, who wanted to be seen as special, who wanted to matter. But Lori's personal life was far less stable than her public image might suggest. Her romantic history was a series of beginnings and endings, marriages that started with hope and dissolved in acrimony. Her first marriage, in 1992 when she was just 19, was to her high school boyfriend. It ended quickly in divorce. In October 1995, she married again, and in 1996 gave birth to a son named Colby. That marriage also ended in divorce in 1998. Then, in 2001, came her marriage to Joseph Anthony Ryan Jr. This marriage would prove to be particularly contentious and would play a significant role in the dark events to come. Joseph and Lori had a daughter together in 2002, a girl they named Tylee Ryan. By all accounts, Tylee was a beautiful child who would grow into a teenager with a sharp wit and an independent spirit. But the marriage between Joseph and Lori was troubled from the start. The couple divorced in 2005, and what followed was a bitter custody battle over Tylee. Lori accused Joseph of sexually abusing both Tylee and her son Colby from a previous marriage. These were serious allegations, the kind that could destroy a person's life even if never proven. Investigators found no evidence to support the claims, and Joseph was never charged with any crime, but the damage was done. He lost equal custody rights in 2007, relegated to supervised visitation with the daughter he loved. That same year, Lori's brother Alex Cox physically attacked Joseph Ryan using a taser to assault him. Alex Cox would later be convicted for this attack and served 90 days in jail. Years later, close friend Angeline Law would claim that Lori had once told her she'd hired her brother to attack Joseph because of things he'd allegedly done to the children. Whether this was true or just another layer of manipulation in Lori's growing pattern of behavior is unclear, but it established a pattern. Alex Cox was willing to use violence to protect his sister or to carry out her wishes. Joseph Ryan died on April 3, 2018, officially of arteriosclerotic cardiovascular disease, a heart attack. He was found in his Arizona apartment during a welfare check. At the time, his death was thoroughly investigated and determined to be from natural causes. Years later, after Lori's arrest in 2020, police reviewed Joseph Ryan's death with fresh eyes. A recording surfaced in which Lori mentioned wanting to kill Ryan, like Nephi killed, a reference to a Book of Mormon figure who killed a man under divine instruction. Despite this disturbing statement and the renewed investigation, authorities found no evidence whatsoever of foul play in Joseph's death. The medical evidence clearly supported natural causes. While the timing may seem suspicious given subsequent events, there is no factual basis to suggest Joseph Ryan was murdered. He died of heart disease, In 2006, between her divorce from Joseph Ryan and his eventual death, Lori married for a fourth time. Her new husband was Leland Charles Anthony Vallow, who went by the name Charles. Charles was a businessman, relatively successful, and, by all accounts, a genuinely good person. Friends described him as generous, caring, and devoted to his family. This marriage appeared, for a time at least, to offer Lori the stability she'd been seeking. In 2013, Charles and Lori made a decision that would ultimately become one of the most heartbreaking elements of this entire story. They adopted Charles's grandnephew, a little boy named Joshua Jackson Vallow, known to everyone as JJ. JJ's biological parents struggled with substance abuse, and when JJ was born with drugs in his system, spending time in the neonatal intensive care unit, it became clear he couldn't stay with them. Charles's sister Kay and her husband Larry Woodcock initially cared for JJ for nearly his first year of life, but ultimately, Charles and Lori adopted him, giving him what everyone hoped would be a loving, stable home. JJ was diagnosed with autism, which meant he required extra care and attention. Friends and family members who knew Lori during this time consistently described her as a patient, devoted mother. April Raymond, who met Lori in 2015 in Hawaii, said Lori did everything for JJ, that he and Tylee were the center of her world. The Lori that people knew in the mid-2000s seemed like a woman who had finally found her calling in motherhood, who had put aside dreams of fame and recognition to focus on raising her children. But something was about to change. Something that would begin subtly, then accelerate with terrifying speed, transforming Lori from a devoted mother into someone capable of unspeakable acts. Meanwhile, about 1,000 miles north, another life was unfolding. Chad Daybell was born on August 11, 1968, in Provo, Utah, into a Mormon family. He grew up in the neighboring city of Springville, and by all accounts, had a relatively conventional Mormon upbringing. He was religious, studious, interested in both history and prophecy, interests that would eventually converge in his career as a writer. On March 9, 1990, Chad married Tammy Douglas in the Manti, Utah Temple, one of the sacred spaces where Mormons perform their most important religious ceremonies. This was Chad's first and, for many years, only marriage. Tammy was a school librarian, described by those who knew her as active, healthy, and devoted to her family and her community. Together, Chad and Tammy would have 5 children: Emma, Seth, Mark, Leah, and Garth. By all appearances, they were a solid family unit, raising their children in the Mormon faith and building a life together. In 2004, Chad and Tammy founded Spring Creek Book Company, a small publishing house focused on religious literature, particularly books aimed at Latter-day Saints readers. Tammy served as chief financial officer and designed book covers, while Chad focused on writing and publishing. This was a modest operation, not making anyone rich, but providing a sense of purpose and a way to share Chad's increasing interest in apocalyptic prophecy and near-death experiences. In 2007, Chad published the first novel in his fictional series, Standing in Holy Places. These books weren't mainstream religious fiction. They were focused on the end times, on preparedness for catastrophic events, on the idea that believers needed to steel themselves for the coming apocalypse. As the years went on, Chad's writing became less clearly fictional and more focused on presenting his alleged visions as real prophecies. He began claiming he'd had a near-death experience that gave him the ability to receive direct messages from God. He asserted that the world would end on July 22, 2020, in a series of natural disasters that would usher in the second coming of Jesus Christ. By the mid-2000s, Chad had developed a following in certain corners of the Mormon community, particularly among those interested in preparedness culture, people stockpiling food and supplies for the end times. He positioned himself as a prophet, someone chosen by God to lead 144,000 people through the apocalypse, a number drawn from the book of Revelation. He also claimed he possessed the ability to see people's souls, to determine whether they had light or dark spirits. Those with dark spirits, he reportedly said, were zombies whose bodies had been taken over by evil forces. These zombies, Chad taught, could only be freed if their physical bodies were killed, releasing the original soul from its prison. These weren't mainstream Mormon beliefs. In fact, they directly contradicted much of what the LDS Church teaches. But to a certain type of believer, someone seeking special knowledge, secret truths, and the promise of being among the chosen few, Chad's teachings were intoxicating. He was offering not just salvation, but significance. He was telling people they were special, that they had been selected for a divine purpose. In 2015, Chad claimed he'd received a divine message telling him to relocate to Rexburg, Idaho. This was supposedly because Utah would be devastated by an earthquake that year, a prediction that never came to pass, though apparently this didn't shake the faith of Chad's followers. That June, Chad and Tammy moved to Salem, Idaho, just outside Rexburg, purchasing a property with several acres of land. Tammy continued working as a librarian while Chad focused on his writing and his growing role as a speaker at religious conferences. Around this same time, Lori Vallow in Arizona became interested in Chad Daybell's books. She reportedly discovered his Standing in Holy Places series around 2015 and became increasingly fascinated with his apocalyptic teachings. Over the next few years, she read more of his books, listened to podcasts featuring excommunicated Mormons discussing end times prophecy, and dove deeper into radical religious beliefs that increasingly diverged from mainstream Mormonism. In late 2018, Lori began corresponding with Chad online. Here were two people, both in what appeared to be stable marriages, both raising families, who found in each other something they'd been missing. For Chad, perhaps it was adoration and validation from an attractive woman who hung on his every word. For Lori, perhaps it was the promise of special significance, the idea that she wasn't just another suburban mum, but rather a goddess with a divine mission. In October 2018, Lori attended a Preparing a People conference where Chad was speaking and signing books. This was where they met in person for the first time. According to later testimony from Lori's friend, Melanie Gibb, the connection between Lori and Chad was immediate and intense. They began communicating constantly, and Chad started telling Lori things that would fundamentally alter her perception of reality. He told her that they had been married to each other in multiple past lives. He said they were destined to be together for eternity and that they would lead the 144,000 chosen people through the end times. He told her that various people in their lives, including their own spouses, had become zombies possessed by dark spirits. Charles Vallow, Lori told Melanie Gibb, had been replaced by a demon named Ned or Hiplos. Tammy Daybell, according to texts between Chad and Lori, had been possessed by a spirit named Viola, and was in limbo. And later, horrifyingly, Lori would tell people that her own children, JJ and Tylee, had also become zombies. This belief system, according to prosecutors and expert testimony, wasn't harmless religious enthusiasm. It provided a framework that justified murder. Because if you genuinely believe that someone's soul has been replaced by an evil spirit, and if you believe that killing their body will free their soul, then murder becomes not just justified but necessary. It becomes a mercy, an act of spiritual liberation. And so, as 2018 turned into 2019, two families, the Vallows in Arizona and the Daybells in Idaho, were headed toward a collision course that would end in death and devastation. Part 2. The First Death. Charles Vallow. Charles Vallow had been noticing changes in his wife for months, and by early 2019, he was deeply worried. The woman he'd married, the mother who had seemed so devoted to their children, was acting completely differently. She was distant, secretive, spending hours on her phone, communicating with people Charles didn't know. She was making increasingly bizarre statements about religious prophecies and the end of the world. And most disturbingly, she'd begun talking about Charles himself in frightening terms. On January 31, 2019, Gilbert, Arizona police officers responded to the Vallow home. The body cam footage from that night shows Charles, clearly distressed, trying to explain to officers that his wife had become unhinged. He told them that Lori believed she was a goddess, preparing for the end of days. He said she'd threatened to murder him. The concern on Charles's face in that footage is palpable. This was a man who knew something was terribly wrong, but didn't know how to fix it. On February 5, 2019, Charles filed for divorce from Lori. In the court documents, he explicitly stated that he feared for his own safety and for the safety of the children. He was, it seems, one of the few people who truly recognized the danger Lori posed. But then, inexplicably, in the following month, Charles dismissed the divorce proceedings. Perhaps Lori had reassured him that things would get better. Perhaps he hoped that whatever phase she was going through would pass. Perhaps he simply loved her enough to keep trying. Whatever his reasons, it was a decision that would cost him his life. Later investigation would reveal that Charles had learned of Lori's infidelity with Chad Daybell 12 days before his death. On June 29, 2019, Charles sent an email to Tammy Daybell, Chad's wife, attempting to warn her about what was happening. "Tammy, my name is Charles Vallow," the email read. "I have some vital and disturbing information regarding your husband and my wife Lori. This is your work email, so I'll wait to send you the evidence. That is very disturbing. You may call or email me from the address where you can receive the information. I apologize to be the one sending this, but something has to be done." Evidence found during the investigation suggests that Tammy opened this email and then deleted it, blocking Charles's email address. Whether she showed it to Chad, whether they discussed it, whether she believed it or dismissed it as the ravings of a jealous husband, we don't know. But she knew, Tammy Daybell knew, more than 3 months before her own death, that her husband was involved with another woman, and that woman was planning something terrible. Police documents would later show that at this point, text messages between Chad and Lori were increasingly frequent and increasingly focused on the people they saw as obstacles. They texted about death percentages for Tammy. They discussed Charles being possessed. They talked about people being in limbo. And they communicated using burner phones, suggesting they knew what they were discussing needed to be kept secret. On July 1, 2019, Charles informed Lori that he was planning to meet with Tammy Daybell in person to tell her about the affair. This appears to have been a tipping point. If Tammy knew and believed Charles, if she took action, divorced Chad, exposed the affair publicly, it would ruin everything. And so, investigators believe, Lori and her brother Alex Cox began planning Charles's murder. On the morning of July the 11th, 2019, Charles went to Lori's house in Chandler, Arizona, intending to pick up JJ for school. What happened next was captured in various ways, through witness statements, 911 calls, and police body cam footage, and the official story is that Charles Vallow died in an act of self-defense. But investigators would later conclude the evidence suggested something far more sinister. According to Alex Cox's account to police, Charles came at him with a baseball bat, hitting him in the back of the head. Alex said he grabbed his gun and shot Charles twice in the chest, killing him in self-defense. But there are problems with this story. Witnesses reported seeing Charles arguing with Lori and Tylee before Alex appeared. Tylee herself told police that Charles had hit Alex with the bat, corroborating her uncle's story. But years later, investigators would question whether she'd been coached or threatened into supporting the narrative. When police arrived, they found Charles Vallow's body on the floor. He was 48 years old. Alex Cox appeared calm, cooperative, answering questions and insisting it had been self-defense. Lori seemed shaken, but not devastated, not in the way you'd expect from a wife who just watched her husband die violently. The police investigated, but without clear evidence contradicting Alex's account, and with Tylee supporting his version of events, no charges were filed. Alex Cox walked free. Looking back, there are red flags everywhere. Alex Cox had a history of violence, particularly when it came to protecting Lori from her husbands. He'd attacked Joseph Ryan with a taser years earlier. Texts between Lori and her friends around this time show her referring to Charles as a zombie who had to be stopped. The day Charles Vallow was killed, his life insurance policy named Lori as the beneficiary for $1 million. Prosecutors would later argue this was part of the motive. However, what Lori apparently didn't know was that Charles had changed his life insurance beneficiary just months earlier, removing Lori and naming his sister Kay Woodcock instead. When the insurance company denied Lori's claim, she was reportedly furious. She'd helped orchestrate the murder of her husband, and she wasn't even going to get the money she'd been counting on. But if Lori was angry about the insurance money, she didn't let it slow her down. Less than 3 weeks after Charles's death, she moved Tylee and JJ from Arizona to Rexburg, Idaho. She rented an apartment in the same complex where Alex Cox conveniently also rented a unit. And perhaps most significantly, she was now living near Chad Daybell, the man who had convinced her she was a goddess, the man who told her they were meant to be together for eternity. The move to Idaho in late August 2019 would mark the beginning of the end for Tylee and JJ. Their faces would appear on missing persons posters. Their grandparents would plead for information on national news. And eventually, 9 months after they disappeared, their small bodies would be found buried in Chad Daybell's backyard, hidden beneath the Idaho soil. But we're getting ahead of the story, because before the children disappeared, before their bodies were buried, there was a period of several weeks when they were still alive, still attending school, still appearing in photos, still capable of being saved. If only someone had intervened, if only someone had seen what was happening and stopped it before it was too late. Part 3. The Last Days of Tylee and JJ. When Lori Vallow moved her children to Rexburg, Idaho in late August 2019, it must have seemed to Tylee like just another upheaval in what had been an increasingly chaotic life. Tylee was 16 years old. At that particular age, where independence and identity are everything, where being uprooted from your friends and your familiar surroundings feels like the end of the world. According to her best friend from Arizona, Tylee hadn't wanted to move to Idaho. But she went anyway, reportedly because she wanted to protect her little brother JJ. JJ was 7 years old, an autistic child who thrived on routine and stability. The move to Idaho disrupted his entire world. He'd been attending Lawrence Institute for Education in Gilbert, Arizona, where teachers and staff understood his needs and worked with him patiently. Now he was being enrolled in Kennedy Elementary School in Rexburg, in a completely new environment with people who didn't know him. Tylee had been attending Perry High School in Gilbert. Whether she was ever enrolled in a high school in Idaho isn't entirely clear from the records, but what is clear is that her time in Rexburg would be measured in days, not months or years. On September 8, 2019, Lori took Tylee and JJ on what would be their last family trip. Lori's brother, Alex Cox, drove them in his Ford F-150 to Yellowstone National Park. They spent the day touring the park, taking photos, appearing for all the world like a normal family, enjoying the natural beauty of Yellowstone's geysers and hot springs and wildlife. There are photographs from this day that would later become crucial evidence. Images of Tylee smiling, images of her wearing a necklace with a distinctive silver charm, images of JJ looking happy despite the upheaval in his life. The last photo taken of Tylee shows her near a body of water at Yellowstone, her long hair blown by the wind, very much alive. The timestamp on that photo would later become significant because it established the last time anyone outside of Lori, Chad, and Alex definitely saw Tylee alive. According to phone records, Alex Cox's phone pinged at a restaurant in West Yellowstone, Montana at 8:37 p.m. that evening. By midnight, they'd returned to Rexburg. The phone records from that night paint a disturbing picture. At around midnight, Alex returned to his own apartment. But at 2:42 a.m., he went back to Lori's apartment. What happened during those early morning hours? What was discussed? We don't know for certain, but we know what happened the next morning. The morning of September 9th, 2019, data from Alex Cox's cell phone placed him at Chad Daybell's property, specifically near the pet cemetery and fire pit area on Chad's land. The phone remained at that location for approximately 2 hours. About 14 minutes after Alex's phone showed him leaving the property, Chad Daybell sent a text message to his wife Tammy, who was away from home. The text read, "I spotted a big raccoon along the fence. I had my gun handy, and he is now in our pet cemetery. Fun times." This text message would later become one of the most chilling pieces of evidence in the case. Because when investigators eventually searched Chad Daybell's property 9 months later, they wouldn't find a raccoon in the pet cemetery. They would find the remains of 16-year-old Tylee Ryan, dismembered, burned, and buried in a shallow grave. The forensic analysis would later reveal just how horrific Tylee's death had been. Her body had been burned while still whole, not in pieces, according to forensic anthropologist Dr. Eric Bartelink. Large parts of her remains were missing, including her arms, legs, and portions of her ribs. What was found was examined by forensic experts who discovered evidence of blunt force trauma to many of her bones. The cause of death was officially listed as homicide by unspecified means, because the extent of the burning and dismemberment made it impossible to determine exactly what had killed her. But there's no question that she died violently. Tylee's DNA would be found on a pickaxe and a shovel in Chad Daybell's garage. Surveillance footage would show Alex Cox and Lori visiting a storage unit on multiple occasions after Tylee's death, presumably disposing of evidence or moving belongings. But in the immediate aftermath, Lori said nothing. She didn't report Tylee missing. She didn't tell friends or family where Tylee had gone. She simply acted as if her teenage daughter had ceased to exist. When people asked about Tylee in the following weeks and months, Lori had various stories. Sometimes she said Tylee was at school. Sometimes she said she was with friends. Sometimes she said she'd gone to college, even though at 16, that would have been unusual. Lori's friend, Melanie Gibb, would later testify that she heard Lori refer to Tylee as a zombie, using the language Chad Daybell had taught her to describe people whose bodies had supposedly been taken over by dark spirits. If Lori truly believed this, if she genuinely thought Tylee's soul had been replaced and that murdering her daughter's body was somehow an act of spiritual liberation, it's hard to imagine a more tragic delusion. But whatever happened to Tylee in Chad Daybell's backyard on that September morning in 2019, one thing is certain: she was gone. And soon, her little brother would follow. JJ Vallow continued attending Kennedy Elementary School in Rexburg after Tylee's disappearance, though one wonders what he was thinking, what questions he might have asked about where his sister had gone. JJ's autism meant he likely relied heavily on Tylee for emotional support and stability. Suddenly losing her must have been deeply confusing and frightening for him. On the weekend of September 21st to 22nd, 2019, Lori's friends, Melanie Gibb and David Warwick, were staying with her in Rexburg. This was about 2 weeks after Tylee had disappeared. On the evening of September 22nd, David Warwick witnessed Alex Cox carrying JJ into Lori's apartment. The boy was reportedly asleep on his uncle's shoulder. But the next morning, when Warwick asked to see JJ, Lori told him that JJ was being a zombie and that Alex had to take him away. This language, calling her own son a zombie, would later be crucial in establishing that Lori had adopted Chad's belief system completely. She wasn't just going along with Chad's ideas to please him. She genuinely believed, or claimed to believe, that her children had been possessed by dark spirits and needed to be eliminated. September 23, 2019, would be the last day anyone definitively saw JJ Vallow alive. The next morning, according to phone records, Alex Cox's cell phone returned to Chad Daybell's property. This time, Alex was there for only about 17 minutes. 17 minutes to kill a 7-year-old boy and hide his body. 17 minutes to end the life of a child who had been born into difficult circumstances, who had overcome challenges associated with his autism, who had been adopted into what he thought was a loving family, only to be murdered by the very people who were supposed to protect him. When investigators eventually found JJ's body, the condition in which he was discovered would break the hearts of everyone who saw the evidence. JJ had been wrapped tightly in black plastic bags, his hands and feet bound with gray duct tape. His mouth had duct tape over it. A white plastic bag had been placed over his head. The official cause of death was asphyxiation. He had essentially been suffocated, wrapped up like garbage, and buried near a tree on Chad Daybell's property. Dr. Garth Warren, the forensic pathologist who conducted JJ's autopsy, noted scratch marks on the plastic bag near where JJ's hands had been. Dr. Warren testified that these could suggest JJ had tried to scratch the bag off his head, that he might have been conscious and fighting for his life as he suffocated. JJ also had bruises on his wrists and ankles, consistent with the duct tape bindings, and an abrasion on his neck. There were no signs of disease or other trauma to his internal organs. A healthy 7-year-old boy killed for no reason other than his mother's twisted beliefs and her desire to be with a man who told her she was special. The last time anyone took a photo of JJ was at Yellowstone on September 8, 2019. In that photo, he's wearing his characteristic smile, his hair neatly combed, looking like any other little boy on vacation with his family. 2 weeks later, he would be dead, his body hidden beneath Idaho's soil, while his mother and her lover carried on as if he'd never existed. On October 29, 2019, Lori officially withdrew JJ from Kennedy Elementary School, telling administrators he would be homeschooled. This was approximately 5 weeks after JJ had been killed and buried. There were no records of any homeschooling arrangements at any of Lori's residences. No school district ever received requests for JJ's academic records. It was a lie, one of many Lori would tell, as she tried to cover up what she'd done. But by late October 2019, Lori had bigger concerns than explaining where her children had gone, because Chad Daybell's wife Tammy was about to become the next victim. Part 4. Tammy Daybell's death. Tammy Douglas Daybell had been married to Chad for 28 years. They'd raised 5 children together. They'd built a life centered around their faith, their family, and their small publishing company. Friends and co-workers universally described Tammy as healthy, active, and engaged with life. She worked as a librarian at Central Elementary School. She attended high-intensity fitness classes regularly. She was taking a clogging class. Several people who exercised with Tammy in the months before her death described her as fit and able to keep up with vigorous workouts without difficulty. Tammy was 49 years old in October 2019. There was no indication she was seriously ill. She hadn't expressed concerns about her health to her friends. She seemed to have years ahead of her to watch her children grow up, to welcome grandchildren, to continue the life she'd built. But Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow had other plans, because as long as Tammy was alive, Chad couldn't marry Lori. And according to the belief system they'd constructed, being together for eternity required eliminating anyone who stood in their way. On October 9, 2019, Tammy called 911. The call was frightening. She reported that a masked man had approached her in her driveway and shot at her with what she thought was a paintball gun. She posted about the experience on Facebook afterward, saying she had no idea who the person was or why they would shoot at her. This incident was terrifying enough on its own, but court documents would later indicate that the masked man had been Alex Cox and that his paintball gun was actually a real firearm. The shot had missed. Whether deliberately or because Alex's aim was off, we don't know. But it was an assassination attempt, the first of what would turn out to be several efforts to kill Tammy. Cell phone records would later show that Alex Cox's phone was near the Daybell property on October 9, 2019. And text messages between Lori and Chad reveal that Lori called an unnamed individual that day and said he can't do anything right. Was she frustrated that Alex had failed to kill Tammy? It certainly seems possible. 10 days later, on October 19, 2019, Tammy Daybell died in her bed. Her son, Garth Daybell, said he and Chad had found her unresponsive that morning and called 911. The 911 call featured Chad sounding distressed, reporting that his wife had died. When Rexburg police officer Alyssa Greenhalgh arrived at the scene, she found Chad and Garth in the living room. She described Chad as distraught and crying. Garth was quiet and reserved, likely in shock. Chad told Officer Greenhalgh that Tammy had woken up around midnight with a coughing fit and had vomited multiple times. He said he'd helped her back to bed and then woke later that morning when she fell from the bed, pulling the blankets off him. That's when he discovered she was unresponsive. He mentioned that Tammy had fallen about a month earlier and didn't have any major medical issues, though he referenced some fainting episodes and shaking fits that might have been seizures. Fremont County Coroner Brenda Dye was called to the scene. When she arrived, Chad was very upset, pacing around. Dye examined Tammy's body and noted that it was cold, with rigor mortis already setting in. Tammy's body showed blood pooling consistent with having died on her back. There was pink foam around her mouth, a fluid that can leak into airways when people die. Dye also noticed what she initially identified as old bruises on Tammy's body. Based on Chad's account of Tammy's recent health issues, the coughing, the vomiting, the supposed fainting spells and seizures, Coroner Dye initially ruled the death as natural causes, likely a heart attack. Tammy's body was released to the family, and no autopsy was performed. Chad and his children specifically declined to have an autopsy done. Tammy was buried 3 days later on October 22, 2019, in a cemetery in Springville, Utah, near her beloved mother. Chad's choice to bury Tammy in Utah rather than Idaho raised some eyebrows among those who knew the family. When questioned about it, Chad explained that the weather was colder in Rexburg and that Tammy would have wanted to be buried near her mother. It seemed like a reasonable explanation, but looking back, you have to wonder if Chad chose to bury Tammy in Utah to make it more difficult for investigators to exhume her body if questions ever arose about her death. Less than 24 hours after reporting Tammy's death, Chad sent a text message to Lori. "I know exactly how you feel." What did he mean by this? Was he referencing the deaths of Charles Vallow and the children? Was he acknowledging that he'd just gotten away with murder, just as Lori had? The exact meaning is ambiguous, but the timing is chilling. Approximately 2 weeks after Tammy's funeral, on November 5, 2019, Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow got married on a beach in Hawaii. Let that timeline sink in. 28-year marriage ends. Wife buried. 14 days later, beach wedding to a woman whose husband had been killed less than 4 months earlier and whose 2 children had recently disappeared. Photos from the wedding show Chad and Lori smiling, barefoot on the sand, looking for all the world like 2 people in love, starting a new life together. Text messages from around this time show Lori talking about their completed mission, about how they were now free to be together eternally. On October 2, 2019, Lori had purchased a wedding ring on Amazon, the same day as another significant event we'll discuss shortly. The ring was later seen on her finger in wedding photos. Chad's adult children, Emma, Seth, Mark, Leah, and Garth, were apparently not invited to their father's quick remarriage. In fact, most of the family seemed to have been kept in the dark about how fast Chad had moved on. When Tammy's sister, Samantha Gwilliam, learned that Chad had remarried only 2 weeks after Tammy's death and 1 month after her burial, she was shocked. Chad had told Samantha that his new wife's name was Lori Ryan. using her daughter's last name, not Vallow, and that her previous husband had died of a heart attack. He also told Samantha that Lori had no children, that they would be empty nesters. This was a lie, of course. Lori had 4 living children at the time of this conversation, her adult son Colby, and the now deceased Tylee and JJ. Even if Chad believed Tylee and JJ were dead, which he certainly should have, since their bodies were buried in his backyard. Telling family members that Lori had no children was a calculated deception designed to prevent questions about where those children might be. Chad and Lori returned from their Hawaiian honeymoon and settled into what they apparently thought would be their new life together. They'd eliminated the obstacles. They'd gotten away with murder. They were free to lead their 144,000 followers into the apocalypse, which, according to Chad's prophecy, would arrive on July 22, 2020. But they'd made a crucial miscalculation. They'd forgotten about JJ's grandparents, Kay and Larry Woodcock. Part 5. The Search for the Missing Children. Kay Woodcock was Charles Vallow's sister, and her bond with JJJ went back to his earliest days. When JJ was born with drugs in his system due to his biological parents' substance abuse issues, Kay and her husband Larry had stepped in immediately. For nearly 10 months, they'd cared for this tiny, vulnerable infant, watching him overcome his difficult start, celebrating every milestone. When Charles and Lori adopted JJ in 2013, Kay had been relieved and happy. She knew her grandson would be raised by her brother, a man she trusted completely, and his wife, who at that time seemed to be a devoted mother. Kay had watched JJ grow from that fragile newborn into a bright, energetic boy. Yes, he had autism, which meant he experienced the world differently than neurotypical children. He needed structure, routine, patience, but he was also funny, affectionate, and full of life. Kay loved him fiercely, as grandmothers do, and made it a point to stay actively involved in his life even though she lived in a different state. After Charles's death, in July 2019, Kay's concern for JJ intensified. Charles had been JJ's advocate, his protector, the parent who truly understood how to care for him. With Charles gone, killed in circumstances that seemed suspicious even if the police had ruled it self-defense, Kay worried about whether JJ would continue to get the care and attention he needed. She tried to maintain regular contact with him, calling frequently to hear his voice, to let him know his grandma loved him, to make sure he was okay. But in the months after Charles's death, something changed. Kay's phone calls with JJ became less and less frequent. At first, when Kay would call, Lori would answer and explain that JJ wasn't available. He was at school, learning and playing with other children. He was sleeping, tired from a busy day. He was playing with his toys and couldn't come to the phone right now. These seemed like reasonable excuses. Children have routines, activities, nap times. Kay understood this, but as weeks turned into months, and Kay still couldn't actually speak to JJ, the excuses started seeming less reasonable and more like evasions. Why was JJ never available? Why couldn't Lori schedule a time for Kay to call when JJ would be free? Why did every attempt to connect with her grandson result in another excuse, another delay, another promise that next time she'd be able to talk to him? Kay's worry transformed into alarm. Something was wrong. She couldn't quite articulate what, but her grandmother's instinct was screaming that JJ was in danger. She shared her concerns with Larry, and together they decided they needed to take action. If Lori wouldn't let them talk to JJ, if she kept making excuses and putting them off, then they needed someone with authority to check on the boy and make sure he was safe. On November 26, 2019, Kay and her husband, Larry Woodcock, asked Rexburg police to conduct a welfare check on JJ. This simple request, grandparents worried about their grandson, asking police to make sure he was okay, would set in motion a chain of events that would eventually expose the full scope of Lori and Chad's crimes. When Rexburg police arrived at Lori's apartment on November 26th, she lied to them. She told officers that JJ was in Arizona, staying with her friend Melanie Gibb. The officers had no reason not to believe her. They noted her statement and left, presumably intending to follow up with Melanie Gibb to confirm JJ's whereabouts. But Lori knew the lie would unravel quickly, so she called Melanie Gibb and asked her to lie to the police if they contacted her, to say that JJ was with her even though he wasn't. Melanie Gibb initially went along with this, but the weight of the lie gnawed at her conscience. The next day, Melanie called the Rexburg police and told them the truth. JJ Vallow was not with her. She had no idea where JJ was. Police immediately returned to Lori's apartment to question her again, but Lori and Chad had fled. The apartment was hastily cleared out, with belongings left behind, half-packed bags on the beds. Rexburg police obtained a search warrant for the apartment, and what they found, or rather, what they didn't find, was deeply troubling. There was no sign that a 7-year-old autistic boy had ever lived there. No toys, no adaptive equipment, no medication, nothing that suggested JJ's presence. As police continued their investigation, they realized that not only was JJ missing, but so was Tylee. When had anyone last seen her? The last confirmed sighting was the photo from Yellowstone National Park on September 8, 2019. That was over 2 months ago, and now both children were gone. Their mother had lied to police and disappeared, and no one could provide any credible information about where the children might be. On December 20th, 2019, Rexburg police held a press conference announcing that 7-year-old Joshua JJ Vallow and 16-year-old Tylee Ryan were missing and believed to be in danger. The police released photos of both children, appealing to the public for any information. The case immediately captured national attention. 2 photogenic children, a mysterious mother, allegations of cult beliefs, and doomsday prophecies. The media couldn't get enough of it. As the story spread, more troubling details emerged. Journalists discovered that Lori's brother Alex Cox had shot and killed her husband Charles Vallow. They found that Chad Daybell's wife Tammy had died suddenly just before Chad married Lori. They learned about the bizarre religious beliefs, the talk of zombies and dark spirits, the claims about being married in past lives. Each new revelation made the case stranger and more disturbing. By late December, police had traced Lori and Chad to Kauai, Hawaii, where they were living in a rented condo, apparently enjoying an extended honeymoon. On January 25, 2020, Lori was formally served with a court order to produce Tylee and JJ within 5 days to authorities in Madison County, Idaho, or face legal consequences. Lori ignored the order. She didn't produce the children. She didn't provide any information about where they might be. She simply continued her Hawaiian vacation as if nothing was wrong, as if 2 children weren't missing, as if their grandparents weren't sick with worry, as if the entire nation wasn't watching and waiting for answers. On February 20th, 2020, Lori was arrested in Kauai and charged with 2 counts of desertion and non-support of dependent children, as well as resisting or obstructing officers, solicitation of a crime, and contempt of court for violating the order to produce the children. Video footage from her court appearance shows Chad sitting in the gallery behind her, showing his support. Outside the courthouse, as Lori was being transported, investigative reporter Morgan Lowe called out questions. "Where are your kids? How come you're not telling anybody where your kids are?" Lori said nothing, her face impassive. Lori was extradited from Hawaii back to Idaho to face the charges. Bail was set at $1 million, which she couldn't afford. She remained in jail while Chad returned to Idaho, moving back into the home where Tylee and JJ's bodies lay buried just 50 feet from the house. The investigation continued to expand. In December 2019, suspicious about the circumstances of Tammy Daybell's death, Fremont County investigators obtained permission to exhume her body from the cemetery in Utah. On December 11, 2019, Tammy's coffin was disinterred and her remains were transported to the Utah Medical Examiner's Office for an autopsy. Dr. Eric Christensen, Utah's chief medical examiner at the time, performed the autopsy alongside Dr. Lily Marsden, then a fellow at the office. What they found contradicted the initial determination of natural causes. Tammy had bruising on her chest and arms that appeared to be recent, not old injuries. The pattern of bruising was consistent with someone being restrained or having pressure applied to them. The doctors also found evidence that contradicted Chad's story about Tammy's supposed health problems. Chad had told coroner Brenda Dye that Tammy had been experiencing fainting spells and seizure-like activity, but Tammy's medical records showed no history of seizures. There was no structural defect in her heart. She was a healthy, 49-year-old woman who had no business being dead. After thorough examination, including microscopic analysis of the bruised tissue, the medical examiners determined that Tammy Daybell had died of asphyxiation, specifically asphyxiation by suffocation. The manner of death was changed from natural to homicide. Someone had killed Tammy Daybell, most likely by smothering or strangling her, then positioned her body to make it look like she died peacefully in her sleep. The pink foam found around Tammy's mouth, which Coroner Dye had noted at the scene, is actually fluid that leaks into the airways during certain types of death, including asphyxiation. The fact that Tammy's body showed blood pooling consistent with lying on her back for some time after death suggested she'd been killed in bed, or at least positioned there very soon after death. Chad's story about her falling out of bed was likely fabricated to explain why he supposedly discovered her body. All of this evidence pointed to one conclusion: Chad Daybell had murdered his wife of 28 years, smothering her in their bed while she slept, so that he could marry Lori Vallow and pursue their twisted vision of leading the faithful through the apocalypse. But while investigators now had strong evidence of Tammy's murder, they still didn't know where Tylee and JJ were. Were they alive somewhere? Hidden away? Were they dead? If they were dead, where were their bodies? These questions tormented everyone working the case, and they especially tormented Kay and Larry Woodcock, who clung to increasingly faint hope that their grandson might still be saved. The breakthrough came from cell phone data. Investigators had been meticulously tracking the locations of Alex Cox's phone through cell tower pings and GPS data, and they noticed something significant. On both September 9th and September 23rd, 2019, the days immediately after Tylee and JJ were last seen, Alex Cox's phone had pinged for extended periods from Chad Daybell's property in Salem, Idaho. This wasn't just a quick visit. On September 9th, Alex's phone was at Chad's property for approximately 2 hours. On September 23rd, it was there for about 17 minutes. These time periods and locations corresponded with suspicious activity that would make sense if someone were burying bodies. In early June 2020, investigators obtained a search warrant for Chad Daybell's property. The warrant was based on the cell phone evidence, the suspicious circumstances of Tammy's death, and the fact that 2 children had been missing for 9 months and had last been in the care of Chad's wife, Lori. On the morning of June 9, 2020, a large contingent of law enforcement officers descended on Chad Daybell's home in Salem. FBI agents, detectives from multiple jurisdictions, forensic specialists, and cadaver dogs all arrived to conduct what everyone feared would reveal the worst-case scenario. Chad Daybell was home when the search began. He asked to contact his attorney and then sat in his car, watching as investigators began marking off areas of interest in his backyard. He watched as they brought in equipment, as they carefully photographed every inch of the property, as they began the painstaking process of excavating areas where the cadaver dogs had indicated possible human remains. Detective Ray Hermosillo would later testify in chilling detail about what they found that day. The first discovery came near a tree in the backyard. They removed the top layer of earth, revealing grass that was shorter than the surrounding area, as if it had been recently disturbed. Beneath the sod and topsoil, they found 3 large, flat, white rocks. Under the rocks were thin pieces of wood paneling, and beneath that, a layer of black plastic. One of the crime scene investigators cut a hole in the black plastic. Beneath it was white plastic, like a bag, and inside that bag was the small body of a child. They could see brown human hair through the plastic. Carefully, methodically, they continued the excavation. The child was wrapped tightly in plastic, with duct tape binding the hands and feet. There was duct tape over the mouth, a white plastic bag over the head. It was JJ Vallow. He was wearing red pajamas and black socks. His small body had been wrapped up like garbage and buried beneath rocks and wood paneling. The care taken to hide him, the layers of earth and stone and plastic, contrasted horrifically with the violence of how he'd been killed. His arms and legs were bound. He'd been suffocated, fighting for breath, scratching at the bag over his head, while his mother and her accomplices had snuffed out his young life. As investigators continued searching the property, they made a second, equally horrific discovery. In an area Chad had described as a pet cemetery, where Chad had supposedly buried a raccoon back in September, they found something far worse than animal remains. The excavation in this area revealed charred remains, burned bone fragments, tissue that had been melted by intense heat. As they carefully sifted through the burned material, they found what had once been a 16-year-old girl. Tylee Ryan's body had been dismembered and burned, her remains mixed with soil and ash. Among the burned material, they found a melted green bucket and a distinctive silver charm, the same charm Tylee had been wearing in the photos from Yellowstone on September 8, 2019. FBI Special Agent Steve Daniels testified that about 14 minutes after Alex Cox's phone left the property on September 9th, Chad Daybell had sent the text to his wife about shooting a raccoon for the pet cemetery. The spelling error, raccoon instead of raccoon, seemed almost insulting, as if Chad couldn't even be bothered to spell-check his cover story for murdering a child. The condition of Tylee's remains was beyond disturbing. Forensic anthropologist Dr. Angie Christensen received more than 100 bone fragments from Tylee's body for analysis. Major parts of the skeleton were represented: the skull, arms, legs, pelvis, but many parts were missing, presumably destroyed by the fire or still buried somewhere on the property. Many of the bones showed evidence of blunt force trauma. The body had been burned whole, not in pieces, based on the burn patterns, and there was no evidence in the toxicology that Tylee had been alive when she was burned. A small mercy in an otherwise unimaginably cruel death. The moment JJ's body was confirmed as found, someone apparently radioed Chad Daybell's daughter Emma, where Chad had been waiting. Detective Eric Wheeler testified that he saw Chad's daughter Emma approach the car where Chad sat handcuffed, crying as Chad told her how to access his bank account. "I'm sorry," he was overheard saying to her. Then Chad drove away from his daughter's house at a high rate of speed. Detective Wheeler pursued him and stopped him, placing Chad under arrest and informing him that JJ's remains had been found. Chad Daybell was taken into custody on June 9, 2020, and charged with 2 counts of destruction, alteration, or concealment of evidence. Additional charges, including murder charges, would come later as the investigation continued and more evidence was gathered. The discovery of the children's bodies answered the question everyone had been asking: where are Tylee and JJ? But it raised 100 more questions. Who exactly had killed these children? When? How? Had they suffered? Did they know what was happening to them? And most painfully for those who loved them, could they have been saved if someone had intervened sooner? The news of the discovery spread quickly. Within hours, every major news organization in America was reporting the story. The images of the small graves being excavated, the footage of Chad Daybell being arrested as he fled his daughter's home, the photographs of JJ and Tylee that had been displayed on missing persons posters for months. All of it flooded television screens and social media feeds across the country. The public reaction was intense and visceral. People who had followed the case from the beginning felt devastated but not surprised. There had been little hope the children were still alive after so many months, but having that hope finally, definitively extinguished was still crushing. Those who were learning about the case for the first time were horrified, struggling to comprehend how a mother could kill her own children and then go on vacation in Hawaii as if nothing had happened. The Rexburg community, where Chad had lived and where his property had become a crime scene, was shaken. This was a small town, a place where people knew their neighbors, where this sort of thing wasn't supposed to happen. Residents had to grapple with the fact that 2 children had been buried just yards from a home in their community for 9 months, while everyone went about their daily lives, completely unaware of the horror that lay hidden beneath the Idaho soil. For law enforcement, the discovery was both vindicating and heartbreaking. The investigators who had worked tirelessly for months, following leads, analyzing phone records, building their case, had suspected all along that the children were dead. The cell phone evidence had pointed to Chad's property specifically, but suspecting something and confirming it are 2 different things. Finding the actual bodies, seeing the condition they were in, understanding the violence that had been inflicted on these innocent children. It affected even the most experienced officers. FBI Special Agent Steve Daniels, who had been part of the excavation team, would later testify about the process of uncovering the burial sites. The testimony was clinical, professional, necessary for the legal proceedings. But behind the clinical language, you could sense the emotional weight of what these investigators had experienced. They'd gone to work that morning hoping they wouldn't find what they suspected they'd find. And then they found it anyway. 2 children, murdered and buried, hidden away like they'd never mattered at all. Kay and Larry Woodcock received the news at their home. They'd known on some level that this was the likely outcome. As the months had passed with no sign of JG, hope had faded. But knowing something intellectually and having it confirmed are 2 different experiences. When the official confirmation came that the remains were indeed their grandson and his sister, the grief that had been building for months finally crashed over them like a wave. Larry Woodcock would later describe the moment in interviews and court testimony. The sense of helplessness, of having tried everything to save JJ and failed. The rage at Lori for what she'd done. The questions that would haunt them forever about whether there was something more they could have done, some action they could have taken that might have changed the outcome. These are the burdens that victims' families carry, the what-ifs and if-onlys that can never be answered satisfactorily. Tammy Daybell's family also received confirmation that day that their worst fears were justified. Tammy's death, which had initially seemed natural, which they'd grieved as a tragic but ultimately unremarkable loss, had in fact been murder. Their father, son-in-law, brother-in-law, the man they'd known for decades, had killed her. And then he'd remarried so quickly, had carried on with his new life, while Tammy lay in her grave, had been living in a house just 50 yards from where 2 children's bodies were buried. The betrayal was unfathomable. In the days following June 9, 2020, more details about the condition of the remains began to leak out through court filings and law enforcement statements. The public learned that JJ had been bound and wrapped in plastic, his mouth taped shut. People learned that Tylee's remains had been burned and dismembered. These details, while necessary for the criminal cases, were agonizing for those who had cared about the children. It's one thing to know someone has been killed. It's another thing entirely to learn the specific, horrific details of how they died. The location of the burials on Chad's property also raised questions about who else might have known. Chad's adult children lived in the area and visited the property. Had they noticed anything suspicious? The pet cemetery where Tylee was buried? Had anyone questioned the story about the raccoon? The tree where JJ was found? Had anyone noticed the disturbed earth, the grass that was shorter than the surrounding area? Investigators would interview Chad's children extensively. The children maintained that they'd had no idea about the burials, that their father had kept them completely in the dark. Some of them initially defended Chad, insisting he was being framed, that there must be some explanation other than their father being a murderer. Over time, as more evidence emerged, some of the children would come to accept the reality of what Chad had done. Others would struggle with that acceptance for much longer. The property itself became a focal point for both media attention and criminal investigation. Aerial footage showed the entire layout: the house where Chad and Tammy had lived, the backyard where the children were buried, the outbuildings and grounds. Forensic teams would continue processing the scene for weeks after the initial discoveries, searching for additional evidence, documenting everything meticulously for the upcoming trials. Meanwhile, attention turned to Vallow Daybell, who was still in jail in Idaho on the child desertion charges. She had now been in custody for about 4 months, having been arrested in February and extradited from Hawaii. The discovery of the bodies on her husband's property, while not immediately changing her charges, obviously pointed toward far more serious crimes. But building murder cases takes time. Prosecutors needed to analyze all the evidence, establish timelines, prove not just that the children were dead, but that Lori was criminally responsible for their deaths. Public sentiment toward Lori, which had already been largely negative, became even more hostile after the bodies were found. People who had given her the benefit of the doubt, who thought perhaps the children were alive somewhere, hidden away for reasons we didn't understand, now had to confront the reality that she'd been lying all along. She'd known exactly where the children were because she'd helped put them there. The smiling photos of Lori on the beach in Hawaii, taken while her children's bodies decomposed in an Idaho backyard, became symbols of her callousness and depravity. The legal process was moving forward, but slowly, as major criminal cases often do. Prosecutors were building their cases methodically. The evidence was complex: cell phone records, text messages, financial documents, witness statements, forensic analyses. Everything needed to be organized, authenticated, prepared for presentation at trial. And throughout this process, both Chad and Lori were being held in custody, unable to flee, unable to communicate with each other, waiting for the justice system to run its course. Part 6. More victims, more crimes. As investigators dug deeper into the history of Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell, they began to realize that the murders of Tylee, JJ, and Tammy were not isolated incidents. There were other suspicious deaths, other attempted murders, a whole constellation of violence orbiting around this couple and their twisted beliefs. On October 2nd, 2019, the same day Lori purchased a wedding ring on Amazon, approximately 17 days before Tammy Daybell's death, Brandon Boudreaux was driving home from the gym in Gilbert, Arizona, when someone shot at his vehicle. The bullet missed his head by mere inches, striking the car instead. Brandon was the ex-husband of Lori's niece, Melanie Pawlowski. The shooter was driving a Jeep registered to the now-deceased Charles Vallow. Brandon survived the assassination attempt, but it was terrifyingly close. Investigators believe Alex Cox was the shooter, following orders or suggestions from Lori as part of a broader pattern of eliminating people who were seen as obstacles or threats. Brandon had been going through a contentious divorce with Melanie Pawlowski, and prosecutors would later allege that Lori hoped to access Brandon's money through her niece Melanie if Brandon were dead. Then there's the death of Alex Cox himself. On December 12, 2019, just weeks after Tylee and JJ had been killed and buried, shortly after Lori and Chad had fled to Hawaii, Alex Cox was found unresponsive on his bathroom floor in Gilbert, Arizona. He was rushed to the hospital but pronounced dead. He was 51 years old. The Maricopa County medical examiner conducted an autopsy and extensive toxicology testing. The primary cause of death was determined to be bilateral pulmonary thromboemboly, essentially blood clots that had become wedged in arteries in his lungs. The medical examiner also noted atherosclerotic and hypertensive cardiovascular disease, meaning plaque buildup in arteries and high blood pressure. Based on this evidence, Alex Cox's death was officially ruled natural causes. Alex's widow, Zulema Pastens, whom he'd married just weeks before his death, along with other family members, issued statements saying they'd always maintained Alex's death had no sinister aspect. They seemed genuinely relieved that the medical examiner had confirmed natural causes, validating what they'd believed all along. However, many people following the case remained suspicious. The timing was awfully convenient. Alex Cox died before he could be questioned about the children's disappearance, before he could be charged with any crimes, before he could potentially testify against his sister. Some speculated that Lori or Chad had somehow poisoned Alex, perhaps fearing he would crack under pressure and expose their crimes. But the medical examiner's report was clear. The blood clots and heart disease were real, and there was no evidence of homicide. Sometimes, even in cases as complex and sinister as this one, people just die naturally. Before he died, Alex Cox had been given a patriarchal blessing by Chad Daybell on November 24, 2019. This recording, later found on Lori's iCloud account, featured Chad telling Alex that he had assisted Chad and Lori in ways that can never be repaid. Chad called Alex a prophet and a hero, predicting he would have a future as a messenger of the Lord. The blessing had no official standing in the LDS Church. Chad had been excommunicated and had no authority to give such blessings, but to Alex, it apparently meant everything. He died believing he'd done the right thing, that he'd helped his sister fulfill a divine mission. The investigation also revealed other suspicious circumstances. Joseph Ryan, Lori's third husband, and Tylee's biological father, had died in April 2018 of what was officially ruled a heart attack. After Lori's arrest, police reviewed Joseph's death, particularly in light of the recording where Lori mentioned wanting to kill him, like Nephi killed. But investigators found no evidence suggesting foul play. Joseph's death appeared to be natural, though the timing, dying when Lori might have found him inconvenient, certainly makes one wonder. Prosecutors also examined the complex web of financial motives underlying these crimes. Charles Vallow's life insurance policy would have paid out $1 million to Lori if she'd still been the beneficiary when he died. Chad Daybell had increased Tammy's life insurance policy shortly before her death. Lori was receiving Social Security survivor benefits for both JJ and Tylee even after they were dead, essentially stealing money meant to care for them. The theft charges in the indictments reflected this ongoing fraud. And then there were the religious conferences, the followers, the people who bought Chad's books and attended his speaking events. Chad and Lori weren't just committing crimes for money or even just for each other. They were operating within a belief system that justified everything they did, a system where they were the heroes, the chosen ones, the people destined to save humanity. Part 7. The Trials and Verdicts. The legal proceedings against Lori Vallow Daybell and Chad Daybell would take years to unfold, involving multiple jurisdictions, complex legal maneuvering, and intense public interest. The sheer scope of the alleged crimes, 3 murders, conspiracy charges, insurance fraud, child desertion, meant the cases would be exceptionally complex. In May 2021, Chad and Lori were finally indicted together on multiple counts of conspiracy to commit murder and first-degree murder for the deaths of Tylee Ryan, JJ Vallow, and Tammy Daybell. They were also charged with grand theft for fraudulently obtaining money meant for the children's care. However, the cases would not be tried together. At Chad's request, and due to concerns about his ability to receive a fair trial if tried jointly with his wife, the judge severed the cases. Lori would be tried first, and Chad's trial would follow later. But before Lori could stand trial, there was a significant delay. On May 27, 2021, she was found incompetent to stand trial after mental health evaluations. The judge stayed her case, sending her for treatment at a mental health facility. This was a controversial decision. Was Lori genuinely mentally ill, suffering from delusions that prevented her from understanding the proceedings? Or was she malingering, pretending to be incompetent to delay her trial? Mental health experts disagreed, but eventually, Lori was restored to competency and deemed fit to stand trial. Lori Vallow Daybell's trial began on April 3, 2023 in Ada County, Idaho. The case had been moved from Fremont County due to concerns about finding an impartial jury, given the extensive pre-trial publicity. Judge Stephen Boyce presided over the proceedings, which would last several weeks and feature testimony from dozens of witnesses. The prosecution, led by Fremont County Prosecutor Lindsay Blake and Madison County Prosecutor Rob Wood, laid out a methodical case. They presented the cell phone evidence showing Alex Cox at Chad's property on the days the children disappeared. They showed text messages between Lori and Chad discussing dark spirits and zombies and death percentages. They called Melanie Gibb, Lori's former best friend, who testified about the bizarre religious beliefs and about hearing Lori refer to her own children as zombies. They presented the autopsy evidence, including the horrific photographs of how JJ and Tylee's bodies had been found. The atmosphere in the courtroom throughout the trial was heavy with emotion and significance. This wasn't just another criminal trial. This was a case that had captured national attention, that had sparked conversations about religious extremism, maternal love, and the capacity for human evil. Every seat in the gallery was filled every day. Reporters from major news organizations documented every moment. And watching it all were the people who had loved the victims, family members seeking justice and answers. The prosecution's opening statement set the tone for everything that would follow. Lindsay Blake stood before the jury and methodically laid out what the state intended to prove. She explained how Lori and Chad had developed a twisted belief system based on Chad's teachings about dark spirits and zombies. She described how this belief system had been used to justify removing anyone who stood in the way of their relationship. She walked through the timeline: Charles Vallow's death in July 2019, Tylee's disappearance in September, JJ's disappearance later that same month, Tammy's death in October, and then the wedding in Hawaii just 2 weeks after Tammy's funeral. Blake pulled no punches in describing what the evidence would show. She told the jury about the cell phone data that would place Alex Cox at Chad's property when the children vanished. She described the text messages that would reveal the couple's mindset. She warned them about the graphic photographs they would see: images of JJ wrapped in plastic and duct tape, images of Tylee's burned and dismembered remains. This wasn't going to be an easy trial to sit through, Blake acknowledged, but it was necessary if justice was going to be served. The defense's opening statement, delivered by Jim Archibald, attempted to create reasonable doubt. Archibald acknowledged that terrible things had happened. No one disputed that the children were dead, that they'd been found on Chad's property. But he argued that the prosecution hadn't proven Lori herself had killed anyone. He suggested that Alex Cox, who had conveniently died before he could be charged or testify, might have been acting alone or primarily responsible. He emphasized that believing in unusual religious ideas, even very unusual ones, wasn't the same as committing murder. The prosecution had to prove beyond reasonable doubt that Lori had actually committed these crimes, not just that she had bizarre beliefs or that she'd acted suspiciously afterward. The prosecution then began presenting their case witness by witness, building methodically toward the most damaging evidence. Early witnesses established the timeline and basic facts. Law enforcement officers testified about responding to Lori's apartment when Kay Woodcock had requested the welfare check, about how Lori had lied about JJ's whereabouts, about how the apartment had been hastily abandoned when police started asking questions. Relatives of the victims testified, their pain evident even as they tried to maintain composure on the stand. Charles Vallow's sister, Kay Woodcock, described her efforts to maintain contact with JG after Charles's death, her growing alarm when she couldn't reach him, her desperate hope, even as months passed, that he might still be alive somewhere. Her testimony was heartbreaking, particularly when prosecutors asked her to identify photographs of JJ alive in happier times, and then the photographs from the crime scene. Kay broke down sobbing, unable to continue for several minutes. Colby Ryan, Lori's adult son from an earlier marriage, testified about the last time he'd spoken with his brother JJ and his sister Tylee. He described how Lori had lied to him about how Charles Vallow died, initially telling him it was a heart attack before the truth about the shooting came out. He talked about trying to reach his siblings after they'd moved to Idaho, about getting evasive answers from his mother, about the growing sense that something was terribly wrong. Watching Colby testify was perhaps one of the most poignant moments of the trial. A son forced to testify against his mother in a case involving the murders of his siblings. The complexity of his emotions was visible on his face throughout his testimony. April Raymond, who had been Lori's close friend in Hawaii before the move to Idaho, testified about how Lori had changed over time. April described the Lori she'd first met in 2015, a devoted mother who seemed to do everything for her children, who was patient with JJ despite the extra demands his autism placed on her, who appeared to love Tylee deeply. Then April described the transformation that began around 2018 to 2019 after Lori became involved with Chad Daybell's teachings, the increasingly bizarre conversations about zombies and dark spirits, the growing distance between Lori and Charles, the sense that Lori was becoming someone April didn't recognize anymore. April's testimony was important because it established that this wasn't a woman who had always been capable of murder. Something had changed, and that something appeared to be her involvement with Chad Daybell. Then came Melanie Gibb, one of the prosecution's star witnesses. Melanie had been Lori's best friend during the critical period when everything fell apart. She'd attended the Preparing a People conference where Lori first met Chad in person. She'd been staying with Lori in Rexburg in September 2019 when JJ disappeared. She'd received the phone call from Lori asking her to lie to police about JJ being with her. And crucially, Melanie had heard firsthand the language Lori and Chad used to describe people, the references to zombies, to dark spirits, to people needing to be eliminated. Melanie's testimony spanned multiple days and covered extensive ground. She described the belief system that Chad had taught and that Lori had embraced. Chad claimed he could see people's light or dark ratings on a numerical scale. People with higher dark ratings were supposedly possessed by evil spirits and had become zombies. Melanie testified that she heard Lori refer to both Tylee and JJ as zombies, using Chad's language to describe her own children as no longer truly human. The defense aggressively cross-examined Melanie, trying to undermine her credibility. John Pryor, who would later represent Chad Daybell, questioned her about her own involvement in the group's beliefs. Hadn't she initially believed Chad's teachings? Hadn't she participated in discussions about dark spirits and demons? Hadn't she initially lied to police herself when Lori asked her to? Melanie acknowledged all of this, but she was clear that she'd eventually recognized how dangerous these beliefs were, that she'd ultimately chosen to tell the truth to police, even though it meant betraying her friend, and that she deeply regretted not seeing the danger sooner. The forensic evidence was presented next. And this was when the trial became truly difficult to witness. FBI Special Agent Steve Daniels walked the jury through the process of excavating the burial sites on June 9, 2020. He used diagrams, photographs, and careful descriptions to explain what investigators had found: the layers of soil and rock covering JJ's body, the plastic bags and duct tape, the condition of the remains. Photographs were shown to the jury, photographs so graphic that they were blocked from the live stream and public viewing, visible only to those physically present in the courtroom. Larry and Kay Woodcock, who had attended most of the trial, left the courtroom during this testimony. They couldn't bear to hear the detailed descriptions of how their grandson had been found. Other family members stayed but were visibly distraught, some crying quietly, others staring straight ahead with expressions of devastation etched on their faces. Agent Daniels also described finding Tylee's remains in the pet cemetery area: the burned bone fragments, the melted green bucket, the silver charm from Tylee's necklace, the sheer violence evident in how her body had been treated even after death. The testimony was clinical and professional, as it needed to be for legal purposes, but the horror of what was being described hung heavy in the courtroom air. Dr. Garth Warren, the forensic pathologist who had conducted the autopsies on both children, testified next. His testimony was perhaps the most difficult of the entire trial. Warren explained in medical detail what he'd found when examining the children's remains. For JJ, he described the plastic bag over the head, the duct tape over the mouth, the bindings on the hands and feet. He explained how he'd determined the cause of death was asphyxiation. JJ had been suffocated. Warren pointed out the scratch marks on the plastic near where JJ's hands had been, suggesting the boy might have been conscious and fighting to remove the bag, trying desperately to breathe as he died. Warren also testified about JJ's bruises on his wrists and ankles from the duct tape bindings, on his arms, an abrasion on his neck. These weren't injuries from disease or accident. They were injuries consistent with someone restraining a struggling child. The implication was clear. JJ had known what was happening to him. He had fought, and his efforts to save himself had been futile because he was a 7-year-old boy being killed by adults who were supposed to protect him. For Tylee, Warren's testimony was different because the condition of her remains made determining an exact cause of death impossible. The burning and dismemberment had destroyed too much evidence. Warren explained that Tylee's death had been ruled homicide by unspecified means. They knew she'd been murdered, but they couldn't determine precisely what had killed her before her body was burned. The toxicology showed no evidence she'd been alive when burned, which Warren noted was at least a small mercy. She hadn't suffered the additional horror of being burned alive. Throughout Warren's testimony, Lori sat at the defense table, showing virtually no emotion. She took notes occasionally, conferred with her attorneys in whispers, but never showed visible distress at the descriptions of how her children had died. This lack of affect, this apparent absence of normal human emotion, was noted by many observers and seemed to harden the jury against her. How could a mother sit unmoved while hearing clinical descriptions of her children's violent deaths? The prosecution also presented evidence about Charles Vallow's death and Tammy Daybell's death, establishing the broader pattern of people dying when they became inconvenient to Lori and Chad. Detective David Stubbs from Chandler, Arizona, testified about the investigation into Charles's shooting. He described the scene: Alex Cox's claim of self-defense, Tylee's statement supporting her uncle's version of events. He acknowledged that police at the time had believed it was self-defense, but that looking back with the benefit of hindsight and additional information, there were red flags they'd missed. Dr. Eric Christensen, the medical examiner who'd performed Tammy Daybell's autopsy after her exhumation, testified about finding evidence of asphyxiation. The bruising on Tammy's arms and chest, the pattern suggesting she might have been restrained, the pink foam around her mouth consistent with asphyxiation, the absence of any medical condition that would have caused natural death. Christensen was clear. Tammy Daybell had been murdered, almost certainly smothered in her own bed. The cell phone evidence was presented through multiple witnesses: FBI analysts who'd examined the records, law enforcement officers who'd interpreted the data. Maps and timelines showed Alex Cox's phone at Chad's property on September 9th and September 23rd, 2019, the days immediately after Tylee and JJ were last seen alive. The phone had remained at the location for extended periods, 2 hours in one case, long enough to dig graves and bury bodies, 17 minutes in the other case, long enough to kill a small boy and hide him under a tree. Text messages between Lori and Chad were read aloud in court. Messages sent while both were still married to other people. Romantic messages declaring their eternal love, but also more disturbing messages about death percentages, about dark spirits, about people being possessed. One particularly chilling exchange occurred shortly after Charles Vallow's death. About a month after Charles's passing, Lori's asking Chad, "Do you think there is a perfectly orchestrated plan to take the children?" Blake told the jury, displaying the message. "There is a plan being orchestrated for the children," Chad replied. "I was shown last night how it fit together again." This message, sent before the children disappeared, suggested premeditation. It showed that Lori and Chad had been discussing what to do about the children, that there was a plan, that Chad was claiming divine revelation about how this plan would unfold. It was exactly the kind of evidence prosecutors needed to prove conspiracy and premeditation rather than impulsive killings. Financial evidence was also presented. Records showing that Lori had continued collecting Social Security survivor benefits for both JJ and Tylee even after they were dead. The amounts were substantial, thousands of dollars over the months the children were missing. This wasn't just murder, it was also theft, fraud, a betrayal of the children's memory for money. The prosecution argued this showed Lori's motivation was partly financial, that she wanted the children gone so she could be with Chad, but she also wanted to continue profiting from their deaths. Evidence about Charles Vallow's life insurance came in as well. The $1 million policy that Lori thought she'd inherit, but that Charles had changed to name his sister Kay as beneficiary instead. Text messages and conversations suggested Lori had been counting on that money, that she'd been furious when she learned she wouldn't receive it. This, prosecutors argued, showed another pattern: killing for money that didn't always materialize, but that didn't stop the killing. As the prosecution's case drew to a close, they presented their final witness, a summary witness who tied everything together, showing the jury how all these individual pieces of evidence fit into a coherent narrative. Then they rested, confident they'd proven their case beyond reasonable doubt. The defense's case was much shorter. They called relatively few witnesses, mostly focused on trying to cast doubt on specific pieces of evidence, or to suggest that Alex Cox, now conveniently dead and unable to defend himself, had been the primary actor. They pointed out repeatedly that there was no physical evidence directly linking Lori to the killings, no DNA, no murder weapons with her fingerprints, no witness who saw her personally harm the children. But this argument largely fell flat because the circumstantial evidence was so overwhelming. Lori didn't need to personally kill the children to be guilty of their murders. The law recognizes that people who plan murders, who conspire with others to carry them out, who help cover up the crimes afterward, are just as guilty as the person who physically commits the act. And the evidence showed Lori doing all of those things, calling her children zombies, lying about their whereabouts, collecting their benefits after death, fleeing to Hawaii, showing no concern about finding them when police came asking. Colby Ryan, Lori's adult son from an earlier marriage, testified. He spoke about the last time he'd talked to his brother JJ and his sister Tylee. He told the jury how Lori had lied to him about how Charles Vallow died, initially telling him it was a heart attack, then never addressing why she'd lied even when he directly asked her about it. Watching Colby testify was heartbreaking. A young man trying to make sense of how his mother could have done such terrible things to his siblings. Kay and Larry Woodcock attended much of the trial, sitting through testimony about how their beloved grandson had been killed and buried. There were moments when Larry had to leave the courtroom overcome with grief. Kay's face throughout the trial showed the devastating impact of the case. A grandmother who had tried to protect her grandson, who had raised the alarm when she couldn't reach him, but who had ultimately been unable to save him. Lori's defense attorneys, led by Jim Archibald, had a nearly impossible task. The evidence against their client was overwhelming. Their strategy seemed to be to suggest that Alex Cox was responsible for the murders, that Lori might have known about them afterward but hadn't directly participated, and that the prosecution hadn't proven beyond reasonable doubt that Lori herself had killed anyone. But this defense fell apart under scrutiny. Even if Lori hadn't physically killed the children herself, the evidence showed she'd been complicit. She'd called them zombies. She'd lied about their whereabouts. She'd fled when police came asking questions. She'd collected their Social Security benefits after they were dead. And perhaps most damningly, she'd shown no emotion, no remorse, no grief. She'd gone to Hawaii and gotten married while her children's bodies decomposed in Chad Daybell's backyard. On May 12, 2023, after deliberating for about 7 hours, the jury returned its verdict. Lori Vallow Daybell was found guilty on all charges. 2 counts of first-degree murder for JJ and Tylee, 3 counts of conspiracy to commit murder for JJ, Tylee and Tammy, and grand theft. The courtroom was silent as the verdicts were read. Lori showed no visible reaction. On July 31, 2023, Judge Boyce sentenced Lori Vallow Daybell to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge imposed multiple life sentences to run consecutively, one for each murder, meaning even if one conviction was somehow overturned, she would still face life in prison for the others. Lori would never be free again. But the legal saga wasn't over. After her Idaho convictions, Lori was extradited to Arizona to face additional charges related to Charles Vallow's death and the attempted murder of Brandon Boudreaux. These trials would take place in 2025. In the Arizona proceedings, Lori made the unusual and ill-advised decision to represent herself. Despite having court-appointed attorneys available, she chose to conduct her own defense, leading to multiple contentious exchanges with the judge and prosecutors. On April 22, 2025, after about 3 hours of jury deliberation, she was found guilty of conspiring to murder Charles Vallow. Then, on June 12, 2025, she was found guilty of conspiring to murder Brandon Boudreaux. At her sentencing hearing on July 25, 2025, Victim impact statements painted a devastating picture of the harm Lori had caused. Colby Ryan spoke about losing his father, Charles, whom he described as generous and caring. Larry Woodcock, in an emotional statement, told Lori, "I will never call or speak of your name again, murderess. You are nothing." Brandon Boudreau said he would never feel safe if Lori wasn't kept in prison. Judge Justin Boreski, before imposing sentence, addressed Lori directly, saying she had left a wake of destruction stretching across multiple states and that she should never be released from prison. He then sentenced her to 2 additional consecutive life terms with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Combined with her Idaho sentences, Lori Vallow Daybell would almost certainly die in prison. While Lori's trials concluded, Chad Daybell's case was still pending. His trial finally began on April 1st, 2024, in Boise, Idaho, after being moved from Fremont County for the same reason as Lori's trial. Pre-trial publicity made finding an impartial jury difficult in the area where the crimes occurred. The prosecution's case against Chad followed a similar structure to Lori's trial, but with some key differences. They could present evidence from Lori's trial, including her testimony in her own defense, which she'd ultimately declined to give. They had additional time to analyze evidence and build their case. And crucially, Chad was facing the death penalty, which Lori had avoided due to procedural issues with evidence disclosure. The trial lasted about 8 weeks, from jury selection through closing arguments. Prosecutors Rob Wood and Lindsay Blake again led the case for the state, presenting the same methodical evidence: cell phone data, text messages, testimony from Chad's own children, autopsy results, and the terrible photographs from June 9, 2020, when the bodies were discovered. Chad's defense attorney, John Pryor, argued that his client had been manipulated by Lori, that she had created the person who committed these crimes. He suggested that Chad was fundamentally a good man who had been corrupted by his relationship with Lori. He emphasized that there was no physical evidence directly tying Chad to the murders, no DNA, no murder weapons with his fingerprints, nothing that proved beyond doubt that Chad himself had killed anyone. But the circumstantial evidence was damning. The children were buried on Chad's property. Chad had texted about a raccoon for the pet cemetery on the very morning Tylee was killed and buried there. Chad had increased Tammy's life insurance shortly before her death. Chad had married Lori mere weeks after Tammy died, and Chad had shown no emotion throughout the trial, never shed a tear looking at photographs of dead children buried in his backyard. On May 30th, 2024, after less than 6 hours of deliberation, the jury found Chad Daybell guilty on all 8 charges. 3 counts of first-degree murder for Tylee, JJ, and Tammy, 3 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, and 2 counts of insurance fraud. His face remained largely expressionless as the verdicts were read. The trial then moved to the penalty phase, where the jury would decide whether Chad should receive the death penalty or life in prison. Prosecutors argued that the murders were especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel, manifesting exceptional depravity. They pointed out that Chad had exhibited utter disregard for human life and had shown a propensity to commit murder that would likely constitute a continuing threat to society. In a stunning decision, Chad chose not to present any mitigating evidence during the penalty phase. He waived his right to have his attorneys present reasons why he should not be sentenced to death. No evidence of mental illness, no troubled childhood, no remorse, nothing. When Judge Boyce confirmed this decision with Chad, asking if he understood he was giving up the opportunity to present evidence that might save his life, Chad simply responded, "That is my choice." Victim impact statements were presented on Friday, May 31st. Tammy's father, Ron Douglas, spoke about his daughter being treated how she was and finding comfort knowing she was resting peacefully in Utah, buried alone and near her beloved mother. Kay Woodcock spoke about the immense pain the family continued to endure daily, about milestones JJ would never reach. Without any mitigating evidence to consider, the jury deliberated on Chad's sentence. On June 1st, 2024, they returned with their decision: death. All 12 jurors had unanimously agreed that Chad Daybell should be sentenced to death for his crimes. Judge Boyce formally imposed the death sentence on Saturday, June 1st, 2024. Chad showed no emotion as the sentence was announced, his face remaining blank as it had throughout most of the trial. He was also sentenced to 15 years for the insurance fraud charges. He now sits on Idaho's death row, the 9th inmate awaiting execution in that state. Both Chad and Lori have filed appeals of their convictions and sentences. These appeals will likely take years to wind their way through the court system. Idaho has a mandatory post-conviction review process for death penalty cases, and defendants can pursue additional appeals after death warrants are filed. Given that Idaho hasn't executed anyone since 2012 and that a recent execution attempt was halted due to medical complications, it's possible Chad Daybell will die of natural causes before the state executes him. Part 8. Understanding the tragedy: belief, manipulation, and evil. As we step back from the specific events of this case, we're left with difficult questions. How could this happen? How could a mother murder her own children? How could seemingly intelligent people convince themselves that killing was not only acceptable, but divinely ordained? And perhaps, most importantly, what can we learn from this tragedy to prevent future ones? The case of Vallow Daybell and Chad Daybell represents a perfect storm of factors that led to horrific violence. Let's examine each element. First, there's the role of fringe religious beliefs. Chad and Lori weren't mainstream Mormons. They'd gravitated toward increasingly extreme ideas: apocalyptic prophecies, communication with the dead, the ability to identify dark spirits, and the concept of zombies whose bodies had been possessed. These beliefs provided a framework that justified murder. If you genuinely believe someone is no longer human, that their body is merely a prison for their soul, that killing them is actually an act of liberation, then murder becomes not just acceptable, but necessary. This is a pattern we see in other cases involving cult-like groups or extreme religious movements. When people become convinced they have special knowledge, that ordinary moral rules don't apply to them, that they're acting on divine instruction, the normal inhibitions against violence can evaporate. Jim Jones convinced his followers to murder a congressman and then commit mass suicide. The Heaven's Gate cult convinced its members to kill themselves, believing they'd ascend to a spaceship. Charles Manson convinced his followers they were starting a race war. In each case, a charismatic leader with a compelling ideology convinced others to commit acts they never would have considered on their own. Chad Daybell positioned himself as a prophet, someone with direct communication with God. This gave him enormous influence over Lori and others who followed his teachings. When he declared someone a zombie, he was essentially issuing a death sentence. And Lori, seeking significance and special status, embraced this role enthusiastically. She wasn't just a suburban mom anymore, she was a goddess destined to save humanity. That sense of importance, of cosmic significance, can be intoxicating. Second, there's the role of romantic obsession. Lori and Chad weren't just religious partners. They were intensely romantically involved. They believed they'd been married in past lives, that they were soulmates destined to be together for eternity. This romantic obsession blinded them to reality and gave them motivation to eliminate anyone who stood between them. Charles Vallow was killed shortly after he planned to expose Chad and Lori's affair. Tammy Daybell was killed so Chad would be free to marry Lori. Even the children's deaths can be seen through this lens. They were obstacles to Lori and Chad's perfect life together. If Lori was going to run away to Idaho with Chad, what would she do with 2 children, one of whom required special care for his autism? The cold calculation is horrifying, but it's consistent with how people in the grip of obsessive romantic attachment can rationalize nearly anything. Third, there's the financial motivation. Multiple people in this case were killed or targeted for killing partly because of insurance money or financial benefits. Charles Vallow's $1 million life insurance policy, which Lori thought she'd receive. Tammy Daybell's increased insurance policy that Chad would receive. The Social Security benefits Lori continued collecting for JJ and Tylee long after they were dead. The attempted murder of Brandon Boudreaux, through which Lori allegedly hoped to access money through her niece Melanie. Money isn't usually the sole motivation for murder, but it certainly helps push people over the edge. If murdering someone not only removes an obstacle, but also provides financial resources to start your new life, the temptation becomes stronger. This is why insurance fraud charges were included in both Chad and Lori's indictments. The murders weren't just crimes of passion or religious fanaticism, they were also calculated financial crimes. Fourth, there's the role of enablers and accomplices. Alex Cox was central to carrying out these crimes. He shot Charles Vallow. Cell phone evidence places him at Chad's property when the children were killed and buried. He likely attempted to shoot Tammy Daybell and definitely shot at Brandon Boudreaux. Without Alex's willingness to commit violence on his sister's behalf, many of these crimes might never have occurred. Alex's relationship with Lori was unusual. He'd attacked her husband Joseph Ryan years earlier. Based on his pattern of behavior, investigators believed he was utterly devoted to her in a way that went beyond normal sibling loyalty. Some have speculated about whether their relationship was inappropriately close, though this has never been confirmed. What is clear from the evidence is that Alex saw himself as Lori's protector and was willing to commit violence on her behalf. His death from natural causes in December 2019, while preventing him from facing justice, may have actually saved lives without Alex as their enforcer. Chad and Lori's ability to kill was substantially limited. There were also other people in Chad and Lori's orbit who didn't directly participate in crimes but who enabled their behavior through passive acceptance. Melanie Gibb heard them talking about zombies and dark spirits, but didn't immediately alert authorities. Zulema Pastenes, who later married Alex, was aware of some of the group's beliefs. Other members of their religious circle heard Chad's teachings and didn't recognize how dangerous they were. None of these people are criminally responsible, but their passivity allowed Chad and Lori to operate longer than they otherwise might have. Fifth, and this is important, there's the question of mental illness. Mental health experts who evaluated Lori came to different conclusions at different times. Initially, she was found incompetent to stand trial. Later, she was deemed competent. During her trials, she showed no remorse, no emotional response to seeing photographs of her dead children. This lack of empathy could suggest antisocial personality disorder, commonly called sociopathy or psychopathy, though no formal diagnosis was made public. There's also evidence that could suggest genuine delusion. Laurie's behavior became increasingly bizarre, starting around 2018 to 2019. Friends described a dramatic change in her personality. She went from being described as a devoted mother to someone capable of killing her children. This rapid personality change could indicate a psychotic break or the development of a delusional disorder, though experts disagreed on this assessment. The truth is probably complex. Laurie may have been predisposed to certain personality traits, narcissism, lack of empathy, a need for admiration and significance that made her vulnerable to Chad's manipulative ideology. Then, immersed in his teachings, she may have developed genuine delusional beliefs that reinforced what she already wanted to believe, that she was special, that ordinary rules didn't apply to her, that killing was justified. However, prosecutors successfully argued she understood the wrongfulness of her actions, which is why she was found competent to stand trial. Sixth, there were numerous system failures that allowed these crimes to occur. When Charles Vallow went to the police in early 2019, telling them his wife had threatened to kill him and that he feared for the children's safety, police took a report but didn't take immediate protective action. Charles was killed less than 6 months later. Could police have done more to protect him? Perhaps, though it's also true that domestic violence situations are notoriously difficult to manage, and police often can't act without clear evidence of imminent danger. When Alex Cox shot Charles Vallow, claiming self-defense, police investigated but decided not to file charges. Was this the right decision? In hindsight, knowing what we know now, it seems like a tragic error, but at the time, Alex's story was supported by Tylee's statement, and there may not have been sufficient evidence to prove it wasn't self-defense. Still, one wonders if more aggressive investigation might have uncovered evidence of premeditation. When Tammy Daybell died suddenly, the coroner accepted Chad's explanation and ruled it natural causes without an autopsy. This was a mistake, though an understandable one. Tammy's family declined an autopsy. Chad presented a plausible story about her health issues, and nothing immediately suggested foul play. But if an autopsy had been performed in October 2019, Tammy's death would have been ruled a homicide. Chad would have been arrested, and Tylee and JJ might still have been alive to testify against their mother. These weren't malicious failures. They were failures of training, of imagination, of resources, of protocols. Police, coroners, social workers, they're all dealing with countless cases, limited budgets, incomplete information. They can't investigate every death as if it might be murder. They can't remove children from their parents based solely on bizarre religious beliefs without evidence of actual abuse. The systems did what systems do. They followed established procedures, made decisions based on available evidence, and moved on to the next case. But the consequences of these failures were catastrophic. 3 people were murdered who might have been saved if someone in authority had connected the dots earlier, had taken the warning seriously, had looked deeper when something seemed off. Part 9. The Victims. Remembering Tylee, JJ, and Tammy. In discussing this case, it's easy to focus on the perpetrators, the twisted beliefs, the murders, the investigations, the trials. But we should never forget that at the center of this story are 3 innocent victims whose lives were cut short. Tammy Douglas Daybell was 49 years old when she was murdered by her husband of 28 years. She was a school librarian who loved working with children. She was physically fit and active, taking exercise classes and clogging lessons. She was a devoted mother to her 5 children and had been looking forward to becoming a grandmother. Friends described her as kind, helpful, and engaged with her community. Tammy's death was particularly cruel because it was carried out by someone she trusted completely. She went to sleep in her own bed next to her husband and never woke up. Chad Daybell, the man she'd built a life with, the father of her children, smothered her while she slept. The bruising found on her body suggests she may have struggled, that she may have woken during the attack and fought for her life. The terror she must have felt in those final moments is unimaginable. Tammy's family attended the trials and spoke about the impact of her loss. Her father talked about finding comfort in knowing she was at rest near her beloved mother. But no amount of comfort can erase the fact that she was murdered, that her husband betrayed her in the most fundamental way possible, that her children lost their mother years before they should have. Tylee Ryan was 16 years old when she was killed. She was a teenager with a sharp sense of humor, according to those who knew her. She loved Chipotle. She loved driving her Jeep. She was at that age where young people are figuring out who they are, what they want from life, what kind of person they want to become. All of that potential was stolen from her. Tylee's life had been difficult even before her murder. Her biological father, Joseph Ryan, had a contentious relationship with her mother. Tylee was caught in the middle of their custody battle, subjected to allegations and counter-allegations. When Joseph died in 2018, Tylee lost her father. When Charles Vallow was killed in 2019, she lost her stepfather. She witnessed Charles's shooting and may have been coerced into supporting Alex Cox's self-defense story. By the time Lori moved Tylee to Idaho, the girl had been through more trauma than most adults experience in a lifetime. And then, on September 9th, 2019, she was killed, her body dismembered and burned, buried in a pet cemetery like she was nothing. The cruelty of how she was treated, both in death and in the disposal of her remains, is staggering. Tylee's older brother Colby spoke movingly about her during the trials. Her best friend from Arizona, Vaisia Idaho, talked about their friendship, about how she'd always hoped Tylee was alive somewhere, how she couldn't bear to believe otherwise. Tylee deserved so much better than the life and death she got. Joshua Jackson, JJ Vallow, was 7 years old when he was murdered. He was born with drugs in his system due to his biological parents' substance abuse and spent time in the neonatal intensive care unit. Despite this difficult start, JJ was adopted by people who were supposed to love and protect him. He was diagnosed with autism, which meant he needed extra care and patience, but people who knew him described him as a happy boy who loved to play and laugh. JJ had already lost so much by September 2019. His adoptive father Charles, who truly loved him, had been killed. His sister Tylee had disappeared. He was in a new state, attending a new school, away from everyone familiar. And then, one night, he was suffocated, bound with duct tape, wrapped in plastic bags, and buried under rocks and dirt. The evidence suggests JJ may have been conscious as he was being killed, that he scratched at the bag over his head, trying to get it off, trying to breathe. A 7-year-old autistic boy, confused and terrified, fighting for his life, while the adults, who should have protected him, instead murdered him. It's a level of cruelty that defies comprehension. JJ's grandparents, Kay and Larry Woodcock, became the public face of the search for him. They never gave up hoping he'd be found alive, even as months passed, with no word. When his body was discovered, Larry could barely contain his grief in the courtroom. Kay spoke about milestones J.E. would never reach: birthdays, first days of school, graduations, all stolen from him. In remembering these victims, we honor their lives, not just their deaths. Tammy was a woman who dedicated her career to helping children learn. Tylee was a teenager with her whole life ahead of her. JJ was a little boy who deserved love and care. They were real people with hopes and dreams, and people who loved them. They weren't zombies, they weren't obstacles. They were human beings with inherent value and dignity. And while nothing can bring them back, while no amount of justice can undo what was done to them, we can at least ensure they're remembered not as victims in a sensational true crime case, but as individuals who mattered, whose lives had meaning beyond the circumstances of their deaths. Part 10. Lessons and Implications. As we reach the end of this long journey through one of the most disturbing true crime cases in recent American history, it's worth asking, what can we learn from the tragedy of Vallow Daybell and Chad Daybell? How can we honor the memories of Tammy, Tylee, and JJ by ensuring something like this doesn't happen again? First, we must recognize the warning signs of radicalization. When someone you know begins expressing increasingly extreme beliefs, especially beliefs that dehumanize others or that claim special knowledge that justifies harming people, that's a red flag. Chad Daybell's teachings about zombies and dark spirits weren't harmless religious enthusiasm. They were a framework for murder. If someone in your life starts talking about people as if they're not fully human, as if killing them would be justified or even necessary, that person may be dangerous. The challenge is distinguishing between unusual but harmless beliefs and genuinely dangerous ideology. Plenty of people hold unconventional religious or spiritual views without becoming violent. The key warning signs include dehumanizing language towards specific people, claims of divine authority to harm others, increasing isolation from friends and family who question the beliefs, and escalating rhetoric about taking action against those deemed evil or possessed. Second, we must take domestic violence threats seriously. When Charles Vallow went to the police in January 2019, telling them Laurie had threatened to kill him, that should have triggered more intensive intervention. Domestic violence doesn't always escalate gradually. Sometimes there's a sudden shift where someone who has never been physically violent before makes credible threats. Those threats should be taken seriously, investigated thoroughly, and responded to with appropriate protective measures. The problem is resources. Police departments are overwhelmed with domestic violence calls. They can't investigate every case to the degree it might deserve. They have to make judgment calls based on limited information. But Charles Vallow's case had specific warning signs: bizarre religious beliefs, threats of murder, concerns for children that in hindsight should have prompted more action. Third, we need better coordination between different jurisdictions and different agencies. The crimes in this case spanned multiple states: Arizona, Idaho, Hawaii. Different police departments investigated different incidents: the shooting of Charles Vallow in Chandler, the disappearance of the children in Rexburg, the death of Tammy Daybell in Salem, the shooting at Brandon Boudreaux in Gilbert. For a long time, no one was connecting these dots because they were happening in different places, investigated by different agencies. Better information sharing, better coordination, better systems for flagging when the same names keep appearing in suspicious incidents across jurisdictions. All of these could help catch serial offenders before they rack up multiple victims. This is particularly important in our mobile society, where people can easily move from state to state, starting over in new communities where no one knows their history. Fourth, we need to reform how we handle suspicious deaths. Tammy Daybell's death should never have been ruled natural causes without an autopsy. A healthy 49-year-old woman doesn't just die in her sleep without explanation. The coroner's willingness to accept Chad's story about health problems that Tammy's medical records didn't support, combined with the family's refusal of an autopsy, resulted in a homicide being missed. Some states have laws requiring autopsies in certain circumstances: sudden death of someone under a certain age, deaths in police custody, suspicious circumstances. Perhaps those laws need to be expanded and more strictly enforced. Perhaps coroners need more training to recognize red flags. Perhaps there need to be protocols that prevent families from refusing autopsies when there are suspicious circumstances, even if that interferes with religious beliefs about handling the dead. Fifth, we need better mental health intervention systems. If Lori Vallow was genuinely mentally ill, experiencing delusions that made her believe she was a goddess and her children were zombies, she needed treatment, not just legal consequences. But our mental health system is notoriously inadequate. It's difficult to get someone involuntarily committed for treatment even when they're clearly a danger to themselves or others. Privacy laws prevent sharing mental health information even with family members who might be able to help. Insurance often doesn't adequately cover mental health treatment. These systemic problems mean that people in mental health crisis often don't get help until they've already committed crimes. By then, it's too late for prevention. We're in the realm of punishment and incapacitation. We need a system that can intervene earlier, that can recognize when someone is becoming dangerous and provide treatment before violence occurs. Sixth, we must be more vigilant about protecting vulnerable populations, particularly children with special needs. JJ Vallow was autistic, which made him particularly vulnerable. He couldn't advocate for himself as well as a neurotypical child might. He relied completely on adults to meet his needs. When those adults decided he was an inconvenience, he had no way to protect himself or escape. Schools, doctors, social workers, anyone who works with special needs children should be trained to recognize signs of abuse or neglect. They should be empowered to intervene when something seems wrong. And the systems for checking on these children need to be robust enough that they can't simply disappear without someone noticing and investigating. Seventh, we need to address the role of social media and online communities in radicalizing individuals. Chad Daybell built his following largely through online channels. Self-published books sold on Amazon, podcasts, online discussion groups. These platforms allowed him to find an audience for his extreme views and to connect with people like Lori who were susceptible to his influence. This isn't an argument for censorship or restricting free speech, but we should recognize that the internet makes it easier for people with dangerous ideologies to find each other, to reinforce each other's beliefs, and to create echo chambers where increasingly extreme views seem normal. As a society, we need to figure out how to balance free expression with preventing radicalization, how to allow religious freedom while stopping dangerous cults from forming. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, we need to rebuild community connections that might catch warning signs early. In older, more tight-knit communities, Someone would have noticed when Tylee and JJ disappeared. Neighbors would have known the family, would have asked questions, would have raised alarms. But in our modern, mobile, individualistic society, people often don't know their neighbors well. We can live next door to someone for years without really knowing them. This anonymity allows predators to operate. Lori could move from Arizona to Idaho, and no one in Idaho knew her history. Chad could tell neighbors in Idaho that he was marrying a woman with no children, and no one would know to question it. The community ties that once might have protected vulnerable people have frayed, and we're all more isolated as a result. Rebuilding those connections, knowing your neighbors, being part of community organizations, watching out for each other's children might seem old-fashioned, but it's also protective. It creates webs of relationship that make it harder for predators to operate undetected. Part 11. Where they are now and final reflections. As of October 2025, Vallow Daybell is serving multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole in the Pocatello Women's Correctional Center in Idaho. She will never be free again. Her Arizona sentences, which technically allow for parole after 25 years, are moot given her Idaho sentences. She has filed appeals of her convictions, arguing that there were errors in her trials, but these appeals face long odds. The evidence against her was overwhelming. The trials were carefully conducted, and appellate courts typically defer to jury verdicts when proper procedures were followed. Chad Daybell sits on Idaho's death row at the Idaho Maximum Security Institution in Boise. He is the 9th inmate awaiting execution in Idaho, though the state hasn't successfully executed anyone since 2012. A recent botched execution attempt where officials couldn't establish an IV line to deliver lethal drugs has raised questions about whether Idaho can effectively carry out executions. Chad has also filed appeals and given the typical timeline for death penalty appeals. It's likely he'll be on death row for many years, possibly decades, before any execution could occur, if it occurs at all. Chad and Lori have both lost appeals to have their convictions overturned or their cases retried. The evidence against them was simply too strong, the trials too well conducted, for appellate courts to find reversible error. Unless the U.S. Supreme Court abolishes the death penalty entirely, an unlikely prospect given the current composition of the court, Chad's death sentence will likely be upheld. Kay and Larry Woodcock have become advocates for crime victims' rights and for protecting children. They've spoken publicly about their experience, about the importance of staying vigilant, about never giving up, even when situations seem hopeless. JJ's remains have finally been released to them, and they were able to give him a proper burial with his family. Tylee's remains have also been released and laid to rest. Colby Ryan, Lori's oldest son, has had to process the unimaginable truth that his mother murdered his siblings and conspired to murder his stepfather. He testified against her, helping to ensure justice was served. He's spoken about the importance of remembering Tylee and JJ as the people they were, not just as victims of a horrific crime. Tammy Daybell's 5 children have been placed in an impossible position. Their father murdered their mother, and they've had to grapple with that reality while also processing their grief. Some of them initially defended Chad, believing he was being framed. Others came to accept his guilt more quickly. The family has been torn apart by these events in ways that may never fully heal. Melanie Gibb, who testified for the prosecution in both trials, has had to live with the knowledge that she was close to Lori during the time when these horrible plans were being made. She's expressed remorse for not recognizing the danger sooner, for not alerting authorities earlier. Her testimony was crucial in securing convictions, showing that even when it's difficult, even when it means betraying a friend, sometimes coming forward is the right thing to do. The case has had broader implications beyond the individuals directly involved. It's prompted discussions about religious extremism, about how seemingly normal people can become radicalized, about the warning signs of dangerousness. It's led to calls for reform in how suspicious deaths are handled, how mental health crises are managed, and how child welfare systems operate. The case has also become a cautionary tale about the power of delusion and the danger of believing you're above ordinary moral rules. Chad and Lori convinced themselves they were special, chosen by God, destined for great things. This sense of cosmic significance allowed them to commit horrific acts while feeling righteous about it. They weren't monsters in their own minds. They were heroes in a spiritual war against dark forces. But whatever they believed about themselves, the reality is simpler and more damning. They were murderers. They killed innocent people, including 2 children, for selfish reasons dressed up in religious language. And now they're paying the price, spending the rest of their lives behind bars, their names forever associated with one of the most disturbing family annihilation cases in American history. As we close this exploration of the Doomsday Mom case, we're left with profound questions about human nature, about how easily we can deceive ourselves, about how far people will go when they believe their cause is just. The case of Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell shows us the dark side of faith, the danger of charismatic leaders, and the tragic consequences when the vulnerable are left unprotected. But perhaps it also shows us something else: the importance of people like Kay and Larry Woodcock, who refused to give up searching for their grandson, like Melanie Gibb, who ultimately chose truth over loyalty, like the investigators who painstakingly built the case, and like the prosecutors who ensured justice was served. Evil exists in this world, but so does courage, determination, and the refusal to accept injustice. Tylee Ryan deserved a full life, a chance to grow up, to fall in love, to pursue her dreams. JJ Vallow deserved to be protected, nurtured, allowed to develop to his full potential despite the challenges his autism presented. Tammy Daybell deserved to grow old with her children and grandchildren, to continue serving her community, to die naturally many years from now. They didn't get what they deserved, but in making sure their killers were caught, convicted, and imprisoned, we can at least ensure their deaths mattered, that justice was served, and that their memories are honored not just as victims, but as human beings who deserved better than the fate that found them. Thank you for staying with me through this difficult but important story. The case of Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell is one that demands to be told, not for the sensational elements, but because understanding what happened might help us prevent future tragedies. If you found this deep dive valuable, please consider subscribing to the channel. More importantly, if you or someone you know is in a situation where someone is making threats, expressing violent ideologies, or acting in ways that seem dangerous, please reach out to appropriate authorities. Don't assume someone else will handle it. Don't wait until it's too late. And remember, children like JJ and Tylee depend on adults to protect them. If you see something that doesn't seem right, speak up, ask questions. Don't be afraid to be wrong if it means potentially saving a life. Until next time, take care of yourselves and take care of each other. And hold your loved ones close, because we never know how much time we have with the people we love.